A golden age of power, prosperity, and false security. At its height, the empire believed itself eternal. From the snow-dusted mountains of the north to the sun-washed ports of the southern seas, banners of the crown flew proudly over cities carved from stone and ambition. Roads stretched endlessly across the land, binding distant provinces together like veins carrying the lifeblood of civilization. Merchants traveled safely beneath imperial protection. Soldiers stood disciplined and loyal, and the people, ordinary men and women, went about their days with a quiet confidence that history itself had chosen their world to endure forever. Peace, or what passed for peace, had reigned for nearly a generation. The Senate Hall in the capital city gleamed each morning as sunlight poured through its towering arches. Senators debated trade routes, tax reforms, and ceremonial honors rather than survival or defense. Political rivalries existed, of course, but they were refined, wrapped in rhetoric and tradition. Assassination plots and coups belonged to the distant past, stories told by old historians who spoke of darker ages when order had not yet been perfected. To the ruling class, stability was not a temporary state, it was proof of superiority. The empire's economy flourished like never before. Grain flowed from fertile valleys, iron from the eastern hills, and gold from colonies across the sea. Markets buzzed with voices speaking dozens of languages, yet all transactions bowed to a single currency stamped with the emperor's profile. Trade agreements stretched beyond the horizon, and foreign envoys arrived not as equals, but as hopeful partners seeking favor. Wealth reshaped the cities. Grand theaters hosted nightly performances, celebrating heroic legends and divine destiny. Aqueducts carried fresh water into even the poorest districts, a visible reminder of the state's generosity. Public baths, libraries, and forums became gathering places where citizens debated philosophy, sports, and the latest decrees from the capital. It was easy, dangerously easy, to believe that progress itself was irreversible. Children born in this era knew no hunger, no invasion, no fear of sudden collapse. They grew up assuming protection was permanent, that armies would always stand at the borders, and that leadership would remain wise simply because it always had been. The empire's military, vast and meticulously organized, had not fought a major war in years. Generals spent more time at banquets than battlefields, discussing strategy as theory rather than necessity. Fortresses along the frontier were well maintained, yet their walls had not been tested in a lifetime. Soldiers trained rigorously, but many had never drawn their swords in true combat. Victory had become an expectation, not an achievement. In the countryside, farmers prospered. Seasonal harvest festivals grew larger each year, filled with music, wine, and praise for the emperor who had secured the peace. Taxes were heavy but predictable, and predictability itself was seen as a luxury. As long as crops grew and roads remained open, few questioned how fragile this balance truly was. Religion, too, played its role in sustaining confidence. Temples overflowed with offerings, thanking the gods for continued favor. Priests preached that divine forces smiled upon the empire, that its rule brought order to a chaotic world. Omens were interpreted optimistically, warnings softened into reassurances. Even eclipses were described as signs of renewal rather than disruption. Yet beneath the marble and ceremony, subtle cracks had begun to form. The Senate's debates, though calm on the surface, grew increasingly detached from reality. Decisions were made to preserve prestige rather than prepare for uncertainty. Provinces far from the capital sent reports of unrest, minor rebellions, economic strain, cultural resistance, but these were dismissed as exaggerations or temporary inconveniences. After all, the empire had survived worse, or so they believed. The ruling elite insulated themselves within layers of luxury and tradition. Advisors told leaders what they wanted to hear, not what they needed to know. Military budgets were quietly redirected toward monumental architecture and public spectacles meant to reinforce the image of strength rather than its substance. Meanwhile, at the edges of the world, rival powers watched carefully. They studied trade patterns, military rotations, and political divisions. They noticed how the empire spoke endlessly of peace, but rarely of sacrifice. They understood what the empire itself refused to admit. Long stability breeds complacency. Inside the cities, ordinary citizens felt a vague unease they could not name. Life was comfortable, yet rumors traveled faster than official decrees. A caravan delayed, a governor replaced without explanation, grain prices rising slightly in regions once abundant. These details meant little individually, but together they formed a quiet undercurrent of anxiety. Still, festivals continued. The emperor appeared regularly on public balconies, waving to cheering crowds, his speeches filled with promises of continued prosperity. He spoke of unity, destiny, and legacy. Never once did he speak of preparation, restraint, or humility. The people applauded, not because they believed blindly, but because belief itself had become a habit. History, after all, had rewarded them so far. Scholars recorded this period as the empire's peak, an era of unmatched order and cultural brilliance. Art reached new heights, laws were codified with precision, and education spread beyond the elite. Future generations would look back on these years with longing, calling them the last moment when everything still seemed possible. What they would not record, at least not honestly, was how loudly the silence screamed. The empire mistook stillness for strength, routine for resilience. It forgot that peace is not the absence of danger, but the space between dangers, and in that space, vigilance must live, or disaster will. As the sun set each evening over the capital's golden rooftops, casting long shadows across the marble streets, no one noticed how those shadows grew slightly longer each day. No one sensed that the same roads that carried wealth and unity could soon carry armies and refugees. How desire for power began to corrupt the foundations. Ambition did not arrive as an enemy. It entered the empire softly, dressed in silk and reason, speaking the language of progress and necessity. No banners were raised, no alarms sounded. There was no single moment historians could later point to and say, "This is where it began." Instead, ambition seeped into the foundations like water through stone, slow, patient, and unstoppable. In the Senate hall, debates grew sharper, not louder. Senators no longer argued about what was right for the empire, but about who would be remembered for making it right. Prestige became a currency more valuable than gold. Votes were traded quietly in private chambers, sealed not with ink, but with promises of future influence. Power, once a burden accepted with reluctance, had become a prize. The emperor remained the symbol of unity, yet even his authority was no longer absolute. Advisors surrounded him in layers, each filtering truth according to personal interest. Information became selective, warnings were softened, threats reframed as opportunities. The emperor heard what ambition allowed him to hear, and nothing more. Beyond the marble halls, the elite learned how to bend the system without breaking it. Governorships were no longer earned through service, but through loyalty. Provincial leaders competed not to stabilize their regions, but to extract the most wealth before their rivals replaced them. Taxes rose subtly, justified as necessary for imperial security, though much of the revenue disappeared into private estates and offshore trade ventures. Corruption wore a respectable face. Merchants with connections received exclusive contracts, strangling competition and reshaping markets. Laws once written to protect citizens were revised to favor those who funded political campaigns and public spectacles. Justice became flexible, interpreted differently depending on status and proximity to power. To the common people, these changes were almost invisible. Life continued much as before. Festivals still filled the streets, grain still arrived in the markets, soldiers still marched in perfect formation. But beneath the surface, trust began to erode. Small injustices accumulated, unfair rulings, unexplained arrests, debts forgiven for the wealthy, but enforced ruthlessly against the poor. Each incident alone seemed insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern. In private estates overlooking the capital, secret gatherings took place under the cover of respectability. Wine flowed, candles flickered, conversations turned from philosophy to strategy. Noble families, once united by shared identity, now measured one another as rivals. They spoke of succession. The emperor was aging, and though no one said it openly, the question of who comes next haunted every political calculation. Alliances were formed not for the empire's future, but for individual survival within it. Old friendships fractured, long-standing traditions were quietly ignored when they stood in the way of advantage. Ambition thrives in uncertainty, and the elite cultivated uncertainty carefully. The military was not immune. Promotions increasingly favored political loyalty over battlefield experience. Generals learned that victory mattered less than visibility. Those who spoke honestly about weaknesses found themselves reassigned, sidelined, or accused of disloyalty. Silence became safer than truth. As discipline softened, the army remained impressive in appearance, but fragile in spirit. Soldiers noticed the change. Orders grew inconsistent. Supplies arrived late. Officers argued over authority. The unity that once defined the legions began to fracture, replaced by personal loyalties and quiet resentment. Still, no one called it a crisis. In the provinces distant from the capital's illusions, governors ruled like kings. Some enforced order with cruelty, others with indifference. Local cultures were suppressed in the name of unity, breeding resistance rather than loyalty. Reports of unrest were rewritten before reaching the Senate, transformed into manageable inconveniences. Reality became negotiable. Religion, once a moral compass, adapted to ambition's needs. Priests aligned themselves with powerful patrons, interpreting divine will to support political agendas. Sacred texts were quoted selectively. The gods, it seemed, always favored whoever currently held influence. Faith lost its innocence. Among the people, rumors spread quietly, not of invasion or collapse, but of betrayal from within. Stories of officials enriching themselves, of soldiers paid late, of laws changing without explanation. Fear did not dominate daily life, but doubt began to whisper, and doubt is far more dangerous than fear. Some citizens protested peacefully, demanding transparency and fairness. Their voices were met with polite promises, then silence. Others turned inward, choosing survival over resistance. A few radical thinkers warned that the empire was consuming itself, but their writings were dismissed as pessimism, or worse, treason. The empire did not fall because it was attacked. It weakened because it forgot why it existed. Ambition reshaped language itself. Greed was called efficiency. Control was labeled stability. Exploitation became strategy. And as long as results appeared positive, no one questioned the cost. Yet the cost was everywhere. Infrastructure repairs were delayed while monuments rose. Soldiers trained less while parades grew larger. Diplomacy gave way to intimidation. The empire still expanded, but it expanded hollowly, wide, not deep. At night, in the quiet moments when celebration faded, some among the elite felt unease. They sensed the imbalance, the unnatural tension holding everything together. But ambition does not allow reflection for long. There was always another rival to outmaneuver, another advantage to secure. The system rewarded those who took and punished those who hesitated. By the time the consequences became visible, ambition had already done its work. The foundations remained standing, but they were cracked, weakened from within. Loyalty had become transactional. Leadership had become performative. Unity had become an illusion sustained by force and tradition rather than shared purpose. The empire still looked magnificent. That was the tragedy, because collapse rarely begins with chaos. It begins with confidence, with powerful men and women believing the rules no longer apply to them. Class divisions, silent anger, and growing resistance. The divide did not appear overnight. It widened slowly, almost politely, like a crack in marble that only architects noticed at first. From a distance, the empire still looked unified, its cities alive with commerce, its banners flying high. But beneath the surface, society was splitting into worlds that no longer understood one another. At the top stood the privileged. The elite lived behind gates of stone and tradition, insulated from the consequences of their decisions. Their homes overlooked the city, bathed in light, and guarded by loyalty purchased with gold. For them, the empire was an idea, an inheritance to be managed, expanded, and enjoyed. Hardship existed only in reports and statistics, softened by distance and comfort. Below them lived the majority. Artisans, farmers, dock workers, and laborers carried the weight of prosperity on their backs. They built the monuments, harvested the grain, and fueled the trade that enriched the state. Their lives were not miserable, but they were increasingly fragile. A bad harvest, a delayed payment, a new tax could undo years of effort. Opportunity had once promised upward movement. Now it felt sealed. Markets told the story clearly. Prices rose faster than wages. Debt became common. Independent craftsmen disappeared, replaced by monopolies backed by political influence. Families who had lived with dignity for generations found themselves struggling not for comfort, but for survival. And dignity, once lost, leaves scars. The law, supposedly blind, had begun to see very clearly who mattered. Minor crimes by the powerful were overlooked or settled quietly. The same offenses by the poor were punished harshly, publicly. Justice became a performance meant to reinforce order, not fairness. Resentment grew quietly. People stopped complaining openly. Complaints attracted attention, and attention carried risk. Instead, anger found new forms. It appeared in silence, in refusal, in a lack of enthusiasm that spread through workshops and fields. Productivity declined, loyalty faded. The empire's strength relied on participation, and participation was no longer guaranteed. In the poorer districts of the cities, conversations changed. Once filled with gossip and humor, they now carried an edge. People spoke carefully, choosing words that revealed frustration without accusation. They shared stories about unfair taxes, corrupt officials, soldiers who enforced laws without mercy. Each story confirmed what many already felt: the empire no longer belonged to everyone. At night, small groups gathered. Not rebels, not yet, just citizens searching for understanding. They met in abandoned buildings, back rooms of taverns, or quiet corners of temples long neglected by the elite. There they spoke openly about fear, injustice, and the sense that something had gone deeply wrong. Anger found a voice, but not a banner. The ruling class noticed unrest only when it disrupted comfort, when food deliveries slowed, when labor shortages affected construction, when protests blocked major roads. Even then, responses focused on control, not reform. More guards, stricter laws, heavier penalties. Force replaced dialogue. In the provinces, the fracture grew wider. Local populations, already distant from the capital's culture, felt increasingly exploited. Resources flowed outward, rarely returning. Governors ruled with varying degrees of cruelty, protected by the empire's need for order. Appeals for relief vanished into bureaucracy. Loyalty became transactional, and many provinces decided the transaction was no longer fair. Resistance took many forms. Some resisted quietly through tax evasion or delayed cooperation. Others preserved forbidden traditions, refusing cultural assimilation. A few organized networks, sharing food, shelter, and information beyond the reach of official authority. These networks were fragile, but they were growing. The empire had underestimated something essential. People will endure hardship. They will endure injustice, but they will not endure humiliation forever. Among the educated lower classes, scribes, teachers, minor officials, frustration was especially dangerous. They understood the system well enough to see its flaws clearly, yet lacked the power to change it. Many turned to writing. Pamphlets circulated anonymously, criticizing corruption and inequality with careful language designed to evade punishment. Ideas spread faster than armies ever could. The elite dismissed these writings as harmless philosophy. They failed to see that narratives shape reality, that belief precedes action, that revolutions begin not with weapons, but with words that resonate. Even within the military, fractures appeared. Soldiers came from the same communities now struggling under economic pressure. They enforced laws that hurt their own families. Orders felt increasingly disconnected from purpose. Loyalty to commanders weakened as trust in leadership eroded. Some obeyed without question. Some obeyed without belief. A dangerous few began to question obedience itself. The empire responded as empires often do, with symbols. More parades, more monuments, more speeches celebrating unity and strength. The emperor appeared more frequently, his presence meant to reassure. But reassurance without change felt hollow. The distance between ruler and ruled had grown too large to be bridged by ceremony alone. Meanwhile, anger matured. It became focused, strategic, patient. People learned which officials could be bribed, which could be avoided, which must be resisted quietly. They learned how to disappear within the system, how to survive without relying on it. This was not chaos. It was adaptation, and adaptation is the first step toward rebellion. History would later debate this period endlessly. Some would argue the fractures were inevitable. Others would insist reform could have saved everything. But those living through it felt only tension, a tightening pressure like the air before a storm. The empire still stood. Its walls were intact. Its armies were vast. Yet unity, the invisible force holding it all together, was fading. A society divided against itself does not collapse loudly at first. It cracks, whispers, and resists in ways that leaders often fail to recognize. By the time resistance becomes visible, it is usually too late to contain. As dawn broke over the capital, light touched both palace and slum alike. From above, the city looked unchanged. From within, it felt entirely different. The people were no longer merely subjects. They were observers, they were judges, and some were becoming revolutionaries, even if they did not yet know the name for what they were becoming. The empire planted ambition. It nurtured inequality. An ordinary life pulled into the path of history. He never wanted to be remembered. If you had asked him what he desired from life, he would have spoken simply. Steady work, quiet evenings, enough coin to keep his family fed, and a future that did not demand bravery. He was not born to banners or prophecies. No priest had ever whispered his name in reverence. He belonged to the countless ordinary lives history usually forgets. His name was Elias Varro. Elias lived in the lower quarter of the capital, where stone buildings leaned close together and sunlight struggled to reach the streets. He worked as a clerk in the grain registry, counting shipments, recording numbers, correcting the careless mistakes of officials who never visited the districts their decisions affected. It was unremarkable work, invisible work, and that was precisely why he had chosen it. His father had been a soldier, not a hero, just a man who followed orders until one day the orders no longer protected him. He returned from service with a limp and a silence that never fully lifted. Elias learned early what glory cost and how little it paid in return. From that lesson, he built his life carefully, avoiding attention, avoiding risk. History, however, does not ask permission. The first disruption came quietly. A shipment of grain marked as delivered never arrived. Elias noticed the inconsistency while reviewing records late one evening. At first, he assumed error. Errors were common. But when he traced the numbers backward, he found more gaps, more missing shipments, always rerouted, always approved by the same high-ranking official. He hesitated. Reporting discrepancies could mean promotion or punishment. Elias understood the unspoken rules. Those who asked questions too loudly did not last long. Still, something about the pattern unsettled him. These were not abstract figures. Missing grain meant empty bowls, hunger. He corrected the ledger and said nothing. For a time, that was enough. Then the shortages began. Bread lines grew longer, prices rose, anger simmered in the streets. Elias watched neighbors argue over scraps, watched children learn hunger earlier than they should have. And each time he returned to the registry, the numbers told the same lie: abundance where scarcity reigned. The weight of it pressed on him. At night, Elias slept poorly. His father's old words echoed in his mind. Doing nothing is still a choice. Elias hated how true that sounded. He told himself he was powerless, that one man could not challenge a system designed to protect itself. Then the system noticed him. One afternoon, an inspector arrived unannounced, polite, smiling, dangerous. He praised Elias's accuracy, his diligence. Then came the warning, delivered softly, almost kindly. Some discrepancies, the inspector said, were better left unexamined. Stability required cooperation. Elias nodded. He understood the message. Fear settled in his chest, heavy and familiar. For weeks he obeyed. He recorded what he was told to record. He went home each night knowing he was complicit. The city outside grew louder with unrest, but inside the registry, silence ruled. Until the day the riot broke out. It began near the southern market, an argument, a shove, a scream. By nightfall, soldiers flooded the streets. Elias was caught in the chaos while returning home. He saw things he would never forget. A woman beaten for refusing to disperse. A boy dragged away for shouting truth too loudly. Blood on stone that had once hosted festivals. That night, his father spoke for the first time in years. "Empires don't fall," the old man said quietly. "They abandon their people, and the people remember." Something shifted inside Elias. The next morning, he did not correct the ledger. Instead, he copied it. Every discrepancy, every forged approval, every rerouted shipment. He hid the records beneath loose stones in his home, hands shaking as he worked. He did not feel brave, he felt terrified. But fear no longer stopped him, it propelled him. Elias reached out carefully, a former teacher, a dock worker he trusted, a scribe known for quiet dissent. He did not speak of rebellion, only truth, only facts. The response surprised him. They listened. Others joined, slowly, cautiously. These were not warriors or politicians. They were clerks, laborers, minor officials, people invisible enough to move unnoticed. Together they formed a fragile network built on trust and shared risk. Elias never led them. Leadership implies desire. Elias had none. He acted because not acting had become unbearable. When the documents finally surfaced, passed anonymously to the right hands, the impact was immediate. Officials denied everything. Arrests followed. Some disappeared. But the lie had cracked. The people now had proof that their suffering was engineered, not accidental. Elias expected relief. Instead, he felt dread. Because truth, once released, cannot be controlled. The empire responded with force. Curfews tightened, surveillance increased, informants multiplied. The network fractured under pressure. Elias went into hiding, moving between safe houses, sleeping lightly, speaking rarely. He thought often of stopping, of surrendering, of returning to anonymity. But history had already learned his name, in whispers. Among the people, Elias became something he never intended, a symbol, not of strength, but of conscience. Someone ordinary who chose risk over comfort. His story spread, reshaped by hope and desperation alike. That frightened him more than the empire ever had. Heroes are expected to be fearless. Elias was not. Every step forward felt like walking to a cliff. Yet each time he considered turning back, he remembered the breadlines, the ledgers, his father's silence. Responsibility, he learned, is heavier than ambition. By the time the authorities realized how dangerous he was, it was no longer possible to remove him quietly. The idea he represented had grown beyond him. Even if he fell, others would rise. Elias understood this. He was not special. That was the point. History does not always turn on kings or generals. Sometimes it turns on clerks who decide one trembling morning that truth matters more than safety. As the empire moved closer to open conflict, Elias stood at the edge of something vast and unstoppable. He did not know if he would survive. He did not know if change would come in his lifetime.
Alliances, betrayals, and the drums of conflict. War did not arrive with fire or thunder. It arrived in whispers. In the capital, the language of peace grew louder even as preparations for conflict accelerated beneath the surface. Publicly, leaders spoke of stability, unity, and restraint. Privately, maps were unrolled, borders measured, and armies quietly repositioned. The empire smiled at the world while sharpening its blade. Diplomacy became theater. Foreign envoys filled the marble halls, greeted with lavish banquets and generous promises. Treaties were signed with careful wording, phrases that allowed flexibility, loopholes, and plausible deniability. Alliances were no longer built on trust, but on convenience. Each side planned not for mutual defense, but for the moment betrayal would be most profitable. Peace, it seemed, was only temporary by design. The Senate fractured further as war approached. Some senators argued passionately for restraint, warning that the empire was not as unified as it appeared. Others pushed for decisive action, claiming that strength must be demonstrated before weakness invited invasion. Both sides claimed patriotism. Only one side prepared for survival. Military councils met more frequently, though never openly. Generals discussed supply routes, border vulnerabilities, and the loyalty of provincial legions. Old rivalries resurfaced as promotions were promised in exchange for allegiance. Strategy was shaped less by necessity than by politics. The army grew restless. Soldiers felt the shift before anyone else. Training intensified. Leave was shortened. Equipment once stored ceremonially was now inspected, repaired, and redistributed. Orders arrived without explanation. The message was clear, even without words. Something was coming. In taverns near the barracks, conversations lowered to murmurs. Veterans sensed familiar patterns, the quiet before violence, the false calm that always preceded bloodshed. Younger soldiers felt excitement mixed with dread, caught between indoctrinated pride and unspoken fear. Meanwhile, Elias Varro remained hidden. From the shadows, he watched the empire prepare to consume itself. His network, what remained of it, fed him fragments of information, not enough to see the whole picture, but enough to understand the direction. War was being engineered, not because it was necessary, but because it was useful. Conflict had a way of silencing dissent. Emergency powers justified surveillance. Military spending disguised corruption. Enemies abroad redirected anger away from leaders at home. War promised control when legitimacy was slipping. Elias understood this instinctively. The ruling elite needed war. Beyond the empire's borders, rival powers sensed opportunity. Some sought genuine defense, others smelled blood. They formed alliances of their own, fragile and conditional. Spies crossed borders disguised as merchants and scholars. Messages were intercepted. False intelligence was planted deliberately. Truth became a weapon. Inside the empire, governors received contradictory orders. Some were told to reinforce defenses. Others were instructed to provoke border incidents, small enough to deny, large enough to escalate. Skirmishes flared, then vanished from official records. The people were told nothing. Public announcements emphasized peace talks and diplomatic progress. State-controlled writers praised the emperor's wisdom. Temples preached unity and divine protection. Yet soldiers continued to march at night, and grain stockpiles were quietly diverted from markets to military warehouses.
Scarcity returned. Bread lines lengthened again. Anger simmered dangerously close to the surface. This time, however, the mood had changed. The people no longer believed hardship was accidental. They recognized manipulation when they felt it. Resistance adapted. Rather than open protest, citizens withdrew cooperation. Dock workers slowed shipments. Farmers hid grain. Scribes altered records subtly. These acts were not coordinated, but they were widespread. A society does not need leaders to resist when its people share the same realization. The empire noticed. Crackdowns followed. Arrests increased. Curfews tightened. The line between civilian and enemy blurred. Soldiers enforced laws with growing unease, sensing that obedience now placed them opposite their own communities. Elias moved constantly. He no longer sought to expose corruption. That phase had passed. Now survival meant preserving information, evidence of how the war had been manufactured, who benefited, and who would pay the price. He feared what would happen if that truth disappeared. One night, a message reached him through trusted hands. A general, one of the few still respected by the troops, wanted to meet. The risk was enormous. It could be a trap, but Elias understood hesitation carried its own danger. They met in an abandoned watchtower beyond the city. The general spoke plainly. He confirmed what Elias already suspected. War was inevitable. Orders had been given. Borders would ignite within weeks. The justification would be thin but effective. The empire believes war will save it, the general said. It won't. Elias asked the question that mattered most. Can it be stopped? The silence that followed was answer enough. Alliances were already set, betrayals already promised. Too many careers, fortunes, and reputations depended on conflict. Even those who opposed war privately feared speaking publicly. Cowardice, Elias realized, often disguises itself as caution. The drums had already begun. Across the empire, blacksmiths worked day and night. Horses were requisitioned. Young men were conscripted with patriotic speeches and empty assurances. Mothers watched their sons march away beneath banners proclaiming honor and glory. They had seen this before. So had history. As tensions rose, a single border clash finally broke through the illusion of peace. Details were unclear, deliberately so. Each side blamed the other. Retaliation followed swiftly. Diplomacy collapsed overnight. The empire declared defensive war. Crowds gathered in the capital as the announcement echoed through the streets. Some cheered, swept up by ritual and fear. Others stood in silence, understanding what defense truly meant. Elias watched from afar. He felt no triumph in being right, only grief. Because war does not discriminate between the guilty and the innocent. It devours truth as eagerly as bodies, and once unleashed, it obeys no one. As armies mobilized and alliances activated, the empire crossed the threshold it could never uncross. The fragile balance holding society together snapped under the weight of ambition and betrayal. The whispers were gone. In their place came the steady, relentless rhythm of drums, calling men to fight, calling nations to burn, calling history to remember. And for Elias Varro, there was no turning back. He had tried to expose corruption. He had tried to warn.
The war that changed everything forever. The first day of war felt unreal. Dawn broke softly over the capital, sunlight touching marble towers and quiet streets as if nothing had changed. But beyond the city walls, smoke already curled into the sky.
By nightfall, the illusion of normal life would be gone forever. The empire had crossed the point of no return. Along the borders, legions clashed with an intensity unseen for generations. Steel met steel, arrows darkened the sky. Orders were shouted, misunderstood, and lost in the chaos. What had once been discussed in chambers and whispered in corridors now screamed across open fields soaked in blood. War stripped away language. It left only noise, fear, and survival. Soldiers who had trained for years discovered that preparation meant nothing when faced with death. Some fought with disciplined fury. Others froze, overwhelmed by the sudden reality of killing another human being. The ground trembled beneath charging formations, and the air filled with the smell of iron and burning wood. By the second week, casualty lists stretched longer than anyone had predicted. Victory, once assumed, became uncertain. Cities near the front lines changed overnight. Homes were abandoned. Markets collapsed. Refugees flooded inward, carrying stories too terrible to fully repeat. Villages burned, families separated, entire communities erased in hours. The empire had promised protection. It delivered devastation instead. Inside the capital, celebration turned to dread. Public squares that once hosted festivals now displayed recruitment banners and casualty notices. Mothers scanned lists with shaking hands. Fathers stood silent, unable to explain why sacrifice had become necessary. The speeches continued, honor, duty, destiny, but the words rang hollow against the growing evidence of loss. Elias Varro moved among the chaos like a ghost. He traveled with refugees when he could, blending into crowds that shared his fear and exhaustion. Everywhere he went, the same questions followed him. Why did this happen? Who wanted this? When will it end? He had answers. They brought no comfort. The empire's strategy unraveled quickly. Supply lines stretched too far. Commanders competed rather than cooperated. Intelligence failed. Allies hesitated. Betrayals emerged exactly where they had been predicted, at the worst possible moments. Entire battalions were sacrificed to preserve reputations. In one infamous engagement, a general ordered an advance he knew would fail, refusing to retreat because withdrawal would appear weak. Thousands died for pride. The victory he hoped for never came. News traveled slowly, but grief traveled fast. The countryside suffered worst. Armies consumed everything in their path: food, animals, shelter. Fields were trampled into mud. Wells were poisoned. Winter approached, and with it, starvation. Those who survived the fighting faced a quieter, crueler enemy. Hope began to vanish. Religion offered little solace now. Temples filled not with gratitude, but with desperate prayers. Priests struggled to explain why the gods allowed such suffering. Some claimed the war was a test. Others fell silent, unable to justify what they themselves no longer believed. Faith cracked under the weight of reality. The soldiers changed too. The early enthusiasm, however forced, evaporated. Veterans hardened, becoming efficient and distant. New recruits aged years in weeks. Brotherhood formed quickly, but so did numbness. Compassion became a liability. Survival demanded choices that haunted them long after the fighting paused. In rare moments of quiet, they spoke of home, of cities they feared no longer existed, of families they might never see again, of lives interrupted and futures erased. Elias witnessed one such moment near a makeshift camp. A young soldier sat alone, staring at his blood-stained hands. He asked Elias a simple question: was it worth it? Elias could not answer, because no one measures the worth of war honestly until long after it ends, and even then, the dead do not speak. As the conflict dragged on, the empire's internal fractures widened dangerously. Provinces stopped sending resources. Some openly rebelled, refusing to sacrifice more for a government that had abandoned them. Others declared neutrality, effectively withdrawing from the empire without saying so. Unity collapsed under pressure. The ruling elite panicked. Emergency powers expanded. Dissent was labeled treason. Executions became public, meant to restore fear where loyalty had failed. But terror does not rebuild trust. It accelerates collapse. The people understood this instinctively. In the shadows, resistance transformed. No longer subtle, no longer cautious. Sabotage increased. Information leaked across borders. Soldiers deserted in growing numbers, slipping away into civilian life or joining insurgent groups who promised purpose over obedience. The empire was fighting on two fronts now, and losing both. Elias realized the truth too late to prevent it. The war had become self-sustaining. Even those who recognized its futility were trapped by it. To stop fighting would expose weakness. To continue meant annihilation. There were no good choices left. One night, as fires burned along the horizon, Elias stood on a hill overlooking a ruined town. The wind carried the distant sounds of battle, metal, screams, commands dissolving into chaos. He felt smaller than he ever had. History had pulled him in. Now it threatened to bury him. He thought of the ledgers, the lies, the moment he chose truth over safety. He did not regret it, but he mourned what followed. Because truth alone cannot stop violence once it begins. It can only explain it, and explanation does not save lives. By the war's second year, the empire no longer resembled itself. Borders shifted unpredictably. Leadership changed through assassination and disgrace. Entire regions fell into lawlessness. The idea of victory lost meaning. Survival became the goal. Children grew up knowing only war. They played among ruins, mimicking soldiers instead of artisans. Education ceased. Culture withered. Songs turned into laments. Stories lost their endings. The world had caught fire, and fire does not discriminate. In one final campaign meant to turn the tide, the empire committed its remaining strength. The battle was catastrophic. Poor coordination, conflicting commands, a brutal defeat that shattered what little morale remained. Afterwards, silence spread across the land. Not peace, but exhaustion. The war had changed everything. Empires could be rebuilt, cities reconstructed, borders redrawn, but something essential was gone forever. The belief that power guaranteed safety, that leaders acted in the people's interest, that history bent toward progress naturally. The illusion was dead. As Elias walked through the aftermath, he understood his role had changed again. He was no longer a whistleblower or symbol. He was a witness, and witnesses carry a different kind of burden, the responsibility to remember when others want to forget.
Triumph that felt like defeat. The war ended with banners raised and cannons silent. Messengers rode through shattered cities announcing victory. Bells rang where bells still stood. Official proclamations declared triumph, survival, and restored order. The empire had endured. Its enemies had retreated. Its borders, at least on maps, remained intact.
By every formal measure, the war was won, yet no one celebrated. The streets of the capital filled slowly, cautiously, as if the people feared joy itself might be punished. Faces showed relief, not pride, exhaustion, not triumph. The sound of cheering never reached the height leaders expected. Victory had arrived too late and cost too much. The empire stood, but it stood hollow. Elias Varro returned to the capital as the final armies marched home. What he saw felt unfamiliar despite being deeply known. Buildings repaired hastily bore scars that no stone could hide. Entire neighborhoods were missing, replaced by open spaces where memories had once lived. The city breathed, but it did not feel alive. Soldiers returned, changed. Some came back missing limbs. Others returned whole in body, but broken in ways no physician could treat. They struggled to sleep without the sound of distant fighting. Sudden noises sent them reaching for weapons that were no longer there. They spoke little of what they had seen, because words failed and silence felt safer. The empire called them heroes. Many did not recognize themselves in that word. Families reunited awkwardly. Years of separation had created strangers under familiar roofs. Children did not remember fathers. Wives had learned independence out of necessity. Love remained, but it had been reshaped by absence and grief. Victory does not restore what time destroys. The economy collapsed quietly. War contracts ended overnight. Factories shut down. Laborers who had fueled the war effort found themselves unemployed and forgotten. Inflation devoured savings. Promised rewards never arrived. The same leaders who had demanded sacrifice now preached patience. The people listened. They no longer believed. Morally, the empire stood on unstable ground. Emergency laws enacted during the war remained in place. Surveillance did not recede. Executions carried out for security were never investigated. Leaders argued that loosening control would invite chaos. Stability, they claimed, required continued authority. Freedom, once suspended, proved difficult to return. Elias recognized the danger immediately. War had normalized exception. The extraordinary had become routine. The empire justified every injustice with the memory of conflict, as if fear itself were a permanent condition. Society absorbed this lesson deeply. Neighbors watched one another cautiously. Trust, once broken, did not heal easily. Informants who had betrayed friends during wartime reintegrated quietly, protected by official amnesty. Victims received no acknowledgement, no apologies, no truth. Reconciliation was postponed indefinitely. In public, the ruling elite congratulated themselves. They commissioned monuments celebrating resilience. Artists were instructed to depict victory, strength, and unity. Pain was edited out of the narrative, suffering reframed as necessary. History was already being rewritten. Elias attended one such unveiling, a towering statue honoring the guardians of peace. The irony was unbearable. He watched veterans stand beneath it, silent and distant, while politicians delivered speeches about glory. He understood then, victory had not healed the empire, it had anesthetized it. Psychologically, the damage ran deep. People struggled with meaning. Years of sacrifice had been justified by survival, but survival alone felt empty. What had they preserved? A system that exploited them? Leaders who lied? Institutions that failed them when it mattered most? Questions lingered unanswered. Some sought comfort in routine, pretending the war had been an interruption rather than a transformation. Others turned bitter, convinced nothing would ever improve. A dangerous few romanticized the conflict, remembering only camaraderie and purpose, not the cost. The seeds of future violence were quietly planted. Elias continued documenting everything, not battles now, but consequences. Testimonies from soldiers haunted by what they had done, families displaced with nowhere to return, provinces abandoned during Reconstruction because they offered little political value. He saw how victory narrowed empathy. During war, suffering had been shared. Afterward, it became competitive. Whose loss mattered more? Whose pain deserved recognition? The empire lacked the moral courage to confront its own failures honestly. Instead, it chose silence. One afternoon, Elias visited a hospital where wounded veterans were housed out of public view. He spoke with a man who had lost both legs in the final campaign. When asked what victory meant to him, the man smiled weakly. "It means I survived long enough to wonder why." That sentence stayed with Elias. Social bonds weakened further. Communities fractured along lines of blame. Some accused leaders, others blamed rebels, others blamed soldiers. Rarely did anyone accept collective responsibility. The empire won the war, but lost its sense of shared identity. Unity, once enforced by fear, proved unsustainable in peace. As months passed, protests returned, this time quieter, more disciplined. People demanded transparency, accountability, reform. They were not revolutionaries, they were exhausted citizens asking to be treated as human beings again. The response was disappointing but predictable. Delays, committees, promises. Victory had not empowered the people, it had reinforced the habits of control. Elias realized something unsettling. The war had ended, but the conflict had not. It had simply shifted inward, from borders to institutions, from enemies to conscience. Empires rarely collapse immediately after victory. They erode. They erode through moral compromise, normalized injustice, and the refusal to learn from suffering. The cost of victory is not paid once.
Triumph that felt like defeat. The war ended with banners raised and cannons silent. Messengers rode through shattered cities announcing victory. Bells rang where bells still stood. Official proclamations declared triumph, survival, and restored order. The empire had endured. Its enemies had retreated. Its borders, at least on maps, remained intact. By every formal measure, the war was won. Yet no one celebrated. The streets of the capital filled slowly, cautiously, as if the people feared joy itself might be punished. Faces showed relief, not pride, exhaustion, not triumph. The sound of cheering never reached the height leaders expected. Victory had arrived too late and cost too much. The empire stood, but it stood hollow. Elias Varro returned to the capital as the final armies marched home. What he saw felt unfamiliar despite being deeply known. Buildings repaired hastily bore scars that no stone could hide. Entire neighborhoods were missing, replaced by open spaces where memories had once lived. The city breathed, but it did not feel alive. Soldiers returned, changed. Some came back missing limbs. Others returned whole in body, but broken in ways no physician could treat. They struggled to sleep without the sound of distant fighting. Sudden noises sent them reaching for weapons that were no longer there. They spoke little of what they had seen, because words failed and silence felt safer. The empire called them heroes. Many did not recognize themselves in that word. Families reunited awkwardly. Years of separation had created strangers under familiar roofs. Children did not remember fathers. Wives had learned independence out of necessity. Love remained, but it had been reshaped by absence and grief. Victory does not restore what time destroys. The economy collapsed quietly. War contracts ended overnight. Factories shut down. Laborers who had fueled the war effort found themselves unemployed and forgotten. Inflation devoured savings. Promised rewards never arrived.
The same leaders who had demanded sacrifice now preached patience. The people listened. They no longer believed. Morally, the empire stood on unstable ground. Emergency laws enacted during the war remained in place. Surveillance did not recede. Executions carried out for security were never investigated. Leaders argued that loosening control would invite chaos. Stability, they claimed, required continued authority. Freedom, once suspended, proved difficult to return. Elias recognized the danger immediately. War had normalized exception. The extraordinary had become routine. The empire justified every injustice with the memory of conflict, as if fear itself were a permanent condition. Society absorbed this lesson deeply. Neighbors watched one another cautiously. Trust, once broken, did not heal easily. Informants who had betrayed friends during wartime reintegrated quietly, protected by official amnesty. Victims received no acknowledgement, no apologies, no truth. Reconciliation was postponed indefinitely. In public, the ruling elite congratulated themselves. They commissioned monuments celebrating resilience. Artists were instructed to depict victory, strength, and unity. Pain was edited out of the narrative, suffering reframed as necessary. History was already being rewritten. Elias attended one such unveiling, a towering statue honoring the guardians of peace. The irony was unbearable. He watched veterans stand beneath it, silent and distant, while politicians delivered speeches about glory. He understood then, victory had not healed the empire, it had anesthetized it. Psychologically, the damage ran deep. People struggled with meaning. Years of sacrifice had been justified by survival, but survival alone felt empty. What had they preserved? A system that exploited them? Leaders who lied? Institutions that failed them when it mattered most? Questions lingered unanswered. Some sought comfort in routine, pretending the war had been an interruption rather than a transformation. Others turned bitter, convinced nothing would ever improve. A dangerous few romanticized the conflict, remembering only camaraderie and purpose, not the cost. The seeds of future violence were quietly planted. Elias continued documenting everything, not battles now, but consequences. Testimonies from soldiers haunted by what they had done, families displaced with nowhere to return, provinces abandoned during Reconstruction because they offered little political value. He saw how victory narrowed empathy. During war, suffering had been shared. Afterward, it became competitive. Whose loss mattered more? Whose pain deserved recognition? The empire lacked the moral courage to confront its own failures honestly. Instead, it chose silence. One afternoon, Elias visited a hospital where wounded veterans were housed out of public view. He spoke with a man who had lost both legs in the final campaign. When asked what victory meant to him, the man smiled weakly. "It means I survived long enough to wonder why." That sentence stayed with Elias. Social bonds weakened further. Communities fractured along lines of blame. Some accused leaders, others blamed rebels, others blamed soldiers. Rarely did anyone accept collective responsibility. The empire won the war, but lost its sense of shared identity. Unity, once enforced by fear, proved unsustainable in peace. As months passed, protests returned, this time quieter, more disciplined. People demanded transparency, accountability, reform. They were not revolutionaries, they were exhausted citizens asking to be treated as human beings again. The response was disappointing but predictable. Delays, committees, promises. Victory had not empowered the people, it had reinforced the habits of control. Elias realized something unsettling. The war had ended, but the conflict had not. It had simply shifted inward, from borders to institutions, from enemies to conscience. Empires rarely collapse immediately after victory. They erode. They erode through moral compromise, normalized injustice, and the refusal to learn from suffering. The cost of victory is not paid once.
How great civilizations collapse from within. Empires rarely fall the way legends describe. There is no single night of fire that consumes everything, no final trumpet that announces the end, no moment when everyone agrees that greatness has died. Instead, collapse arrives quietly, layer by layer, decision by decision, until one day people wake up and realize the world they trusted no longer exists. The empire did not fall because it was invaded. It fell because it rotted from the inside. Long before the banners were lowered, corruption had become ordinary. Officials no longer asked what was right, only what was profitable. Bribes replaced policy. Loyalty was measured not by integrity, but by usefulness. Positions of power became rewards rather than responsibilities. The machinery of governance still functioned, but without purpose. Elias Varro watched this decay with growing certainty. The war had exhausted the empire's moral reserves, and what followed was not renewal, but indulgence. Leaders spoke endlessly about rebuilding, yet focused entirely on preserving their influence. Reconstruction funds vanished into private estates. Provinces loyal to the capital were favored, while others were neglected until resentment hardened into defiance. Inequality was no longer accidental, it was engineered. Mistakes compounded themselves. Emergency laws, meant to be temporary, became permanent. Fear was easier to govern with than trust. Surveillance expanded. Dissent was labeled instability. Stability became the excuse for repression, and repression became routine. Every choice made sense until they didn't. The ruling council grew increasingly isolated. Surrounded by advisors who feared honesty, leaders heard only reassurance. Warnings from scholars, economists, and regional governors were dismissed as exaggeration. History, they believed, favored the powerful. History never does. The people noticed first. Markets emptied. Public services failed. Justice slowed, then stopped entirely for those without influence. Courts favored connections over truth. Faith in institutions eroded quietly, like stone worn down by constant water. No riots erupted at first. Instead, people withdrew. Civic engagement faded. Taxes were avoided. Military recruitment declined. Citizens stopped seeing the empire as theirs. It became something imposed, not shared. An empire cannot survive that shift. Elias documented testimonies from across the provinces. Farmers who paid levies but received no protection. Merchants ruined by arbitrary regulations. Teachers punished for asking forbidden questions. Soldiers denied promised pensions. Each story alone seemed manageable. Together, they formed a pattern of collapse. Leadership responded too late and incorrectly. To address economic strain, they raised taxes. To suppress dissent, they increased force. To maintain control, they centralized power further. Every solution deepened the problem it aimed to solve. The empire mistook control for cohesion. As trust vanished, elites emerged within the elite itself. Old alliances fractured. Rival councils sabotaged one another behind closed doors. Decisions stalled as leaders prioritized survival over strategy. Governance became reactive, not visionary. The center could no longer hold. Then came the critical moment, the one historians would later argue over endlessly. A peaceful assembly in the outer provinces demanded representation and legal reform, not independence, not revolution, reform. The empire had an opportunity to listen, to adapt, to evolve.
Instead, it chose force. The crackdown was swift and brutal. Images spread faster than authority could contain them. What had been isolated discontent became shared outrage. Provinces that had remained loyal now questioned their allegiance. The empire's greatest strength, unity, collapsed in a single season. Elias stood among the crowds as silence replaced fear. People no longer begged. They no longer negotiated. They simply withdrew consent. An empire can survive rebellion. It cannot survive indifference. Corruption reached its peak in the final months. Officials abandoned posts. Records disappeared. Emergency powers were abused openly. Wealth fled the capital. The ruling council argued endlessly while systems failed around them. The army, once the empire's backbone, fractured along regional lines. Orders were questioned. Salaries went unpaid. Loyalty dissolved into self-preservation. The empire still existed on paper. In reality, it was already gone. The fall was administrative before it was dramatic. Supply chains broke. Communication failed. Provinces began governing themselves out of necessity. Laws varied by region. What remained of central authority issued decrees no one enforced. History was repeating a familiar rule. When legitimacy dies, power follows. Elias returned to the capital as the final symbols crumbled. The great forum stood abandoned. Government buildings were locked, not destroyed, left behind like shells after something living had moved on. No final battle marked the end, only absence. People adapted quickly. They always do. Local councils formed. Trade resumed on smaller scales. Life continued, not because the empire endured, but because people no longer waited for it. The empire had not been overthrown, it had been outgrown. In its final days, the ruling council released a declaration blaming external threats, internal enemies, and historical inevitability. Nowhere did it acknowledge its own failures. Empires rarely confess. Elias archived the document alongside thousands of testimonies he had collected. He understood his role now, not as a participant, but as a witness, because collapse without memory becomes myth, and myth invites repetition. As generations passed, the empire would be remembered selectively. Some would romanticize its golden age, others would demonize its end. Few would confront the uncomfortable truth that the empire fell not because it lacked power, but because it lacked wisdom. Civilizations collapse when they forget why they exist, when institutions serve themselves rather than people, when leaders confuse authority with legitimacy, when fear replaces trust, when reform is delayed until it is impossible. Standing at the edge of the old capital, Elias watched the sun set behind broken towers. There was sadness, but also clarity. The empire had not been destroyed by fate, it had been undone by choices, and history, relentless and impartial, had simply recorded the result. The fall of an empire is never sudden. It is a long decision-making process where every ignored warning, every compromised value, every silenced voice adds another stone to the weight that eventually pulls everything down.
Lessons the modern world still struggles to learn. History is patient. It waits silently as empires rise, flourish, and crumble. It watches as societies are built upon ambition, pride, and hope, and then dismantled by corruption, negligence, and human error. The story of the fallen empire is not unique, it is a mirror, and those who study it must confront what they see reflected, themselves. Elias Varro, now older, walked among the ruins of what had once been the empire's heart. He had witnessed golden ages, rebellions, wars, and the eventual collapse. He had carried stories, names, and lessons across borders and generations. Yet, even as he recounted them to those who would listen, he understood that human nature rarely changes. The patterns were unmistakable. Power concentrated in the hands of the few. Wealth accrued without accountability. Laws were manipulated, not enforced. And when the inevitable crises arrived, those who could act hesitated or acted in self-interest, weakening the foundations they claimed to protect. Modern societies, those across oceans and continents, faced the same challenges in different forms. Democracy could be fragile. Freedom could be hollow if unchecked by ethical responsibility. Prosperity could blind a population to creeping injustice. The echoes were clear. Elias remembered the war most vividly, not for its strategies or battles, but for the countless human stories that persisted amid chaos. He thought of Mara waiting for her husband in vain. He remembered Livia teaching children in a basement when schools no longer existed. He recalled Marcus, the soldier who refused to commit atrocities despite the risk, and Sarah, whose quiet acts of kindness offered hope when despair was nearly complete. These were not the headlines of history books. They were not the figures immortalized in statues or commemorated on coins. They were ordinary people performing acts of courage and compassion that carried meaning far beyond the immediate moment. It was these stories that mattered most. History, Elias understood, is shaped by individuals who choose moral integrity over convenience, truth over expedience, and loyalty over ambition. Yet time and again, societies neglected these lessons. Leaders sought stability without fairness. Citizens compromised ethics for comfort. And when the cost became unbearable, the consequences were catastrophic. In the modern world, these lessons remained painfully relevant. Governments could still centralize power unchecked. Economies could still favor the wealthy over the many. Technology could create unprecedented connection while simultaneously enabling unprecedented surveillance and control. Societies could rise on hope and ingenuity, only to collapse when trust eroded and accountability failed. Elias observed that the patterns were not failures of intelligence, they were failures of vigilance. Awareness of past mistakes does not guarantee prevention. Memory alone is insufficient unless accompanied by active effort to uphold the principles that prevent repetition. He remembered the moment the empire fell, not in dramatic clashes, but in the quiet erosion of trust. Decisions compounded on one another. Ethical compromises, small at first, accumulated until the weight became unbearable. Communities withdrew consent. Soldiers hesitated. Leaders debated endlessly while the world moved past them. Institutions once believed invincible proved fragile. And the people, the ordinary citizens who had lived under that empire, adapted as best they could. They rebuilt in fragments, reconstructed communities, preserved knowledge. Yet the lessons were fragile, surviving in whispers rather than decrees. Modern societies faced the same risk, forgetting the human cost of governance, forgetting that structures and laws are only as resilient as the ethics and conscience of those who uphold them, forgetting that prosperity without equity is a house built on sand. Elias walked through a town now thriving in small ways. Markets had reopened. Schools functioned with children laughing amid rebuilt stone. Communities celebrated festivals once suppressed. And yet, even amid resilience, cracks were visible. Inequality, mistrust, and forgotten grievances persisted like shadows. He realized then that civilization is not measured merely by survival, but by the moral frameworks that sustain it. Technology and progress could preserve knowledge, but they could not instill wisdom.
Citizens and leaders alike needed courage, the courage to speak truth, to act ethically, and to hold one another accountable. Otherwise, even the most sophisticated society could repeat the mistakes of the past. Elias began recording one final account, not as a clerk, not as a whistleblower, not as a witness, but as a chronicler of humanity. He documented the stories that statistics and maps ignored, acts of kindness that outlasted empires, quiet courage that defied tyranny, loyalty that transcended borders, love that endured despite violence. He wrote not to preserve glory or assign blame, but to offer guidance, to remind the modern world that the collapse of a civilization is never inevitable if its citizens remain vigilant, morally conscious, and compassionate. The lessons were simple, yet profound. Power requires accountability. Leadership without checks becomes tyranny. Prosperity demands fairness. Inequality sows instability faster than any foreign enemy. Ethics matter more than expedience. Small compromises compound into catastrophic outcomes. Humanity cannot be legislated. Laws alone cannot prevent cruelty or injustice. They require moral citizens. Memory is a tool, not a shield. Remembering history is futile if it does not inform present decisions. He reflected on how the modern world, technologically advanced, globally connected, was still vulnerable. Nuclear arsenals, financial systems, climate crises, political polarization, all were new contexts, but old patterns repeated themselves. Societies might rise on innovation, yet crumble if human nature went unchecked. Elias also understood hope was not abstract. It was rooted in relationships. Parents raising children with empathy, teachers fostering critical thought, neighbors protecting one another, individuals acting ethically even when convenient alternatives existed. These were the small acts that ripple across time, slowing the repetition of history's cruelties. He imagined classrooms where young citizens learned not just dates and victories, but the cost of complacency. He imagined communities that debated openly, prioritized truth over expedience, and demanded leaders accountable to moral as well as legal standards. He imagined a world that remembered the fallen, honored the courageous, and recognized the ordinary acts that prevent collapse. The echo of the empire's fall was no longer merely a warning, it was a call to action. History, Elias realized, does not repeat itself blindly. It gives humanity the opportunity to learn, but learning requires courage, reflection, and sustained effort. Without these, civilizations remain trapped in cycles of ambition, corruption, war, and decay. He left his chronicles for the next generation not as prophecy, but as instruction. The stories of ordinary courage, the consequences of unchecked ambition, the subtle erosion of morality, all preserved so that modern societies might see themselves clearly. And in those stories, the world might finally grasp the most enduring lesson. Civilizations are not saved by power alone. They are preserved by conscience. They endure through the actions of ordinary people who refuse to look away, who uphold ethics when convenience tempts them, and who remember that humanity itself is the foundation of history. Elias Varro walked away from the ruins, older, weary, but with one certainty. The past was a teacher, relentless in its patience, and for those willing to listen, it offered the knowledge needed to shape a future where the mistakes of yesterday need not dictate the fate of tomorrow. The empire had fallen. The people survived. The lessons remained.